The Weldblundell prism sits in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum inside a sealed glass case. It is a clay prism roughly 20 centimetres tall, inscribed on all four sides in cuneiform by Sumerian scribes sometime around 2000 BCE. The text opens with a phrase that has troubled scholars for over a century after the kingship descended from heaven. 8 kings are then listed, kings the Sumerians recorded not as legends, but as administrators record facts. Their combined reign, the prism states, plainly lasted 241,000 to 200 years. The prism doesn't explain this, it simply moves on. That restraint is worth pausing on. The scribes who copied this document, and it was copied generation after generation across centuries, treated those numbers with the same measured tone they applied to grain inventories and property disputes. No annotation, no apology, no lines separating what we might call myth from what we might call record. The text lists the kings, notes the years, and continues as if stating the unremarkable. Tonight we'll follow what that prism and the civilization that produced it may have been trying to preserve. We'll move through 3 traces: the creation accounts the Sumerians left describing the Anunnaki, the beings they claimed descended from the sky and fashioned humanity for a purpose, the astronomical knowledge encoded across thousands of clay tablets, precise in ways that still prompt careful questions, and the pattern that emerges when you set those Sumerian records beside the flood myths, the creation stories, the sky descending, figures remembered independently by cultures that never shared a coastline or a language. We will not resolve what any of this means. That is not what this space is for, but we'll hold the evidence steadily and we'll let the questions breathe. The Sumerians were by almost every measure the first to build cities at scale, the first to press language into wet clay and make it permanent. Around 3200 BCE in the flatlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, they invented writing, not for literature, not yet, but for accounting. Grain tallies, livestock counts, the careful geometry of surplus. What came later, when the system grew complex enough to carry thought rather than just quantity, is what kept archaeologists arguing through a century and a half of excavation. Because when the Sumerians finally wrote about origins, about where humans came from, who taught the first cities to exist, what moved through the sky, before history had a name, they did not write the way poets write. They wrote the way administrators write. Specific entities, specific roles, specific locations. The beings they called the Anunnaki held territories in particular cities: Enki in Eridu, Enlil, in Nippur, Inanna, in Uruk. Temple ration lists, thousands of them, still held in museum storage, records of the precise volumes of bread and beer and oil delivered to divine statues each morning, midday and evening, across centuries of continuous practice. Whether those offerings fed carved stone or something more difficult to categorize, the Sumerians maintained those lists as though the answer had practical consequences. And then there is the creation account. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in Babylonian copies from around 1800 BCE, but almost certainly drawing from older Sumerian material, describes human origins through what can only be called a procedure. The Agigi Lesser, divine workers, had laboured for what the text variously gives as 40 years or 3600. Depending on the surviving copy, digging the Tigris, excavating irrigation canals. They rebelled. They burned their tools. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil at night. A council convened, and Enki proposed a solution: create a substitute labourer. Mix clay from the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm, with the blood of a slain god named Wa'elu. Fashion something new. What followed the text records without ceremony were failures, 6 of them. Beings produced that were blind or paralysed or incapable of reproduction, each one described in clinical sequence. Each one assigned a role where the specific limitation would not interfere. The viable prototype came later after adjustment. 6 failed attempts before a working model. Not metaphor reaching toward mystery enumeration. A list of what didn't work. Mainstream scholarship reads this as theology ancient peoples encoding social hierarchy into cosmic origin, explaining human imperfection as part of divine design. The interpretation is reasonable, and it has the weight of genuine expertise behind it. Every early civilization built ideologies that justified its structure by grounding it in something larger than politics. The Sumerians were not unique in that impulse. But something in the procedural language keeps pulling attention back. Most creation myths reach for the transcendent. A god breathes life into clay, speaks a word, gestures toward formlessness. The Atrahasis account reaches for something closer to method, materials specified, a source named, failures catalogued in sequence. There is no equivalent in Greek or Egyptian or Norse creation literature for 6 failed prototypes described before a successful revision. Some researchers argue the language simply reflects the Sumerians' unusually literal administrative character, the same culture that invented accounting, writing theology within accountants' habits. That argument deserves to be held. But it doesn't dissolve the observation. The detail is small, and it refuses to go away. There is also the astronomy. The lunar month calculated to 5 decimal places of modern precision, the Venus cycle, matching contemporary measurement, the clay tablet in the British Museum that 2 engineers spent years analysing. Before concluding, it may record the observed trajectory of an asteroid strike in 31233 BCE, preserved carefully enough to be copied and stored for 2.5 millennia afterward. And there are the flood stories 200 cultures anthropologists have counted carrying the same structure, the warning, the vessel, the bird sent forward, the mountain, the offering made when the water finally receded. These are the traces we'll follow tonight. Not toward a conclusion, toward a clearer understanding of what the Sumerians considered worth preserving, across 2,000 years of copying and recopying until the libraries burned, the tablets were buried, and the cuneiform waited in silence for someone to learn to read it again. The clay prism in Oxford still holds its numbers unchanged. 241,200 years, 8 kings, after the kingship descended from heaven. We follow the first trace downward into the texts themselves, read as plainly as the clay will allow before any framework is applied. The ground beneath the writing. In the city of Nippur, around 2400 BCE, the student pressed a reed stylus into a damp clay tablet and copied for perhaps the 100th time in his training a list of cuneiform signs he did not yet fully understand. The tablet he was copying from was already old. His teacher's tablet had been copied from an older one still. The school itself, the Adiba, the tablet house, had been running for generations, turning boys from wealthy families into the only class of person in the ancient world who could read what the civilization had written down about itself. The student's name is not preserved. The tablet he produced that day may be. Some 10,000 practice tablets from Nippur alone have survived buried, when the school's roof collapsed, baked hard by the fire that followed, pulled from the earth by archaeologists working for the University of Pennsylvania beginning in 1889. Many of them are still being studied. This is where the civilization lives now, not in its monuments, which have largely returned to dust, but in its writing. Mud brick erodes, ziggurats dissolve back into the flat plains from which their material was drawn. But fired clay outlasts almost everything. The Sumerians, in the particular accident of their geography, a landscape without stone, without timber, with nothing durable except the river sediment beneath their feet, produced records that the Mediterranean world's parchment and papyrus cultures could not match for sheer physical persistence. A library that burns in Alexandria is gone. A library that burns in Nippur survives as a field of hardened fragments readable waiting. What those fragments contain is a civilization that understood itself in terms we have spent a century and a half arguing about. The Sumerians did not think of themselves as the first humans. They thought of themselves as the latest iteration of something much older, tended by beings they called the Anunnaki, a collective whose individual members held specific cities, specific domains, specific roles in the administration of the world. This was not vague theology. It was organizational in the same way their grain records were organizational. Here is who is responsible for what, here is the territory, here is the chain of authority. The gods had offices, they had houses, they had appetites, and they had, according to the records, made humanity. The Ubaid culture that preceded what we call classical Sumer had already been settled in the Mesopotamian plains for roughly 2,000 years by the time writing emerged. Villages along the Euphrates, small irrigation systems, pottery traded across hundreds of kilometers. The groundwork for something larger was being laid slowly the way soil deepens invisibly, incrementally through the accumulation of seasons. Then around 3500 BC, something accelerated. Uruk expanded from a modest settlement into a city of perhaps 20,000 people in what archaeological stratigraphy suggests was a relatively compressed period. The White Temple rose above the plain on a 13-metre platform. Writing appeared almost fully formed as a system for tracking the temple economy's inputs and outputs. The mainstream reading of this sequence is developmental enough, population enough, surplus enough organisational complexity, and certain innovations become not just possible but necessary. Writing emerges when memory fails. Cities emerge when dispersal becomes inefficient. The Sumerians were not special, they were early. They happened to occupy a river valley that could support the density required to make civilization's next steps inevitable. That reading is coherent. It is supported by stratigraphic evidence. It does not require revision at any major point. And yet the Sumerians themselves described what they had inherited in terms that do not map cleanly onto gradual development. The me, the cultural arts, the techniques of civilization were not in their accounting discovered. They were held by Enki and distributed. Writing was not invented by scribes solving a logistics problem. It was one of the mere power that could be possessed, transferred, even stolen. The myth of Inanna stealing the me from Enki describes her loading them onto a boat while he slept and sailing away before he could retrieve them, a narrative in which the fundamental capabilities of civilization are treated as discrete objects with specific locations, not as emergent properties of complex social organization. Re-hook artifact detail. The list of the me preserved in one Sumerian text includes over 100 items. Kingship, the descent into the underworld. The ascent from the underworld. The craft of the smith. The craft of the leatherworker music. The scribal art. The binding and loosenings of hair. These are not metaphors for social functions. They read more like an inventory of a specific collection, things that could in principle be itemized because they had originally been itemized by someone. None of this constitutes evidence of anything beyond the Sumerians' particular way of explaining what they had. Every culture attributes its foundational capabilities to divine origin rather than human trial and error, because that is how founding myths function. The point is not that the Sumerian explanation was literally true. The point is that the explanation they chose was unusually specific organizational, rather than poetic procedural, rather than transcendent, and that specificity left traces in the clay that have not fully dissolved into comfortable interpretation. Tonight's 3 traces run through that specificity. The first is the creation account itself, what the Sumerians wrote about how humanity came to exist read as plainly as the language allows. The second is the astronomical record, what they knew when they knew it, and what the precision of that knowledge suggests about where it might have come from. The third is the pattern that emerges. Across cultures, flood memories, sky descending, teachers' iterative creation attempts appearing independently in places the Sumerians never reached, and in languages their scribes never read. We follow the writing now as far into the tablets as the surviving clay permits. The procedure in the clay. The tablet known as the Atrahasis epic exists in several copies, the most complete of which dates to approximately 1800 BCE, and was written in Old Babylonian by a scribe who identified himself by name, an unusual act of authorship in a tradition that typically preserved texts without crediting individual hands. The tablet is damaged at its edges, certain passages restored through comparison with fragmentary duplicates found at other sites, but its core narrative survives intact and legible. It begins not with the creation of the world, but with a labour dispute. Before humans existed, a group of lesser divine workers called the Agigi had been assigned the physical maintenance of the earth, digging the Tigris, excavating the Euphrates, clearing land, managing the irrigation networks that the major gods required. According to the text, they had been doing this for what it variously describes as 40 years or 3600, depending on the surviving copy, a discrepancy that scholars have noted without resolving, and then they stopped. The rebellion is described with a specificity that stands apart from the ceremonial language surrounding it. The Agigi burned their tools. They marched at night to the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator among the Anunnaki, and surrounded his house. Enlil inside did not initially understand what was happening. The text preserves his confusion, his call to his vizier, his request to know whether this was an act of war or something else. A council of the major Anunnaki was convened. Enlil's response was punitive: destroy the rebels, but Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water who held the city of Eridu, proposed a different solution. Create a substitute. Fashion a being capable of taking on the labour so that the divine workforce could rest. The council agreed, and what followed in the text is the passage that has drawn the most sustained attention from researchers across very different interpretive traditions. Enki instructs that a god named We'ilu be sacrificed, a being described as possessing Temu, a word translated variously as intelligence, personality, or spirit, depending on the scholarly tradition. The flesh and blood of We'ilu are then mixed with clay drawn from the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm associated with Enki's domain. Ninhursag, the birth goddess, takes this mixture and works with it alongside a group of birth deities. What the text then records in a sequence that runs for several dozen lines is not a single successful creation, but a series of attempts that produce beings with specific enumerated defects. One cannot hold urine, one is blind, one has paralyzed feet, one cannot grasp objects, one is born with neither male nor female characteristics. Each failure is noted in clinical sequence, and for each Enki finds a social role where the limitation becomes relevant. The blind are assigned to music where only hearing is required. The paralyzed are placed as royal advisors where only mind is needed. The procedure continues adjusted after each failure, until a viable prototype is produced. The parallel text known as Enki and Ninmah, which treats the same event from a slightly different angle, and survives in Sumerian rather than Akkadian, adds further procedural detail. In one passage, Enki and Ninmah enter what reads almost like a wager. Each will fashion a human with some deliberate impairment, and the other must find a place for it in the social order. This framing creation as experimenter's test as a series of trials with outcomes evaluated and adapted does not appear in the creation literature of neighbouring cultures in the same form. Egyptian texts describe Khnum shaping humans on a potter's wheel, a single creative act with no failed iterations. Greek traditions give humanity a single moment of formation, then add fire from Prometheus as a secondary gift. The Mesopotamian account alone preserves the record of 6 things that did not work before something did. What to make of this depends significantly on what interpretive frame one brings to it. The academic consensus is measured and reasonable. The failed prototypes explain the existence of disability in the human population by grounding it in divine design rather than in accident or punishment. And the iterative structure reflects the Sumerians' unusually administrative imagination, a culture that invented accounting, applied the same ledger, keeping logic to cosmic origins. This is not a dismissive reading. It is a careful one supported by everything we know about how founding myths function, which is to say they encode social structures and explain conditions that would otherwise require justification. The Sumerians needed a theology of disability, of labour, of hierarchy, and the Atrahasis account provides all 3 in a single narrative framework. What the administrative reading does not fully account for is the texture of the language itself. Most creation myths, even highly developed ones, reach for the numinous at the moment of fashioning. A word is spoken, a breath is given, a gesture transforms inert matter into living form. The Atrahasis account does not do this. It specifies materials. It names a source. It records failures in sequence before recording success. The closest analogy in human literature is not theological, it is procedural. It reads in the plain cuneiform more like a record of what was attempted and what was observed than like a narrative reaching for transcendence. Whether that resemblance reflects the Sumerians' cognitive habits or preserves something transmitted across a longer chain than we have yet traced, is a question the tablet does not resolve. It simply holds the sequence in the order the scribe recorded. It pressed into clay that hardened before anyone thought to ask what kind of document this was supposed to be. The blood of We'ilu requires one further note. In Mesopotamian thought, blood was not merely biological fluid, it carried Temu, the quality of mind and personality that made the sacrificed god suitable as an ingredient. Modern genetics would describe blood as a medium carrying DNA, the molecular information that shapes an organism's capacities. The Sumerians did not have that vocabulary, but they chose blood specifically as the divine contribution to the human composite, Not breath, not word, not light, but a material substance from a being who possessed something worth passing on. That choice in a Sumerian tradition otherwise rich with symbolic alternatives is recorded without elaboration. The scribe wrote it down, the next scribe copied it. Across 15 centuries of cuneiform transmission, no one appears to have found it unusual enough to annotate. The creation account closes with humanity distributed across the land to begin its labour. What the text does not record is any moment of ceremony, any marking of the occasion as significant. Humans were made because the Agigi needed rest. The solution was implemented. The administrative problem was resolved. We follow next the record the Sumerians kept of the sky, a record whose precision set against the tools they are known to have possessed raises a different kind of question entirely. What the priests recorded before dawn. The Sumerians calculated the lunar month at 29.5359 days. The figure we use today, derived from atomic clocks and laser ranging equipment aimed at reflectors left on the moon's surface, is 29.53059 days. The difference between these two numbers, separated by 5,000 years of intervening civilization by the collapse and recovery of entire knowledge traditions, by the invention and abandonment of dozens of counting systems, is less than 1 second per day. This is not a coincidence of rounding. It is a measurement arrived at by people working with water clocks, accurate to roughly 15 minutes read sighting rods and the accumulated observational records of generations of priests stationed on elevated platforms above flat plains where the horizon was unobstructed and the sky undiminished by any artificial light displayed everything it had to show. The men who produced this figure worked from the top of the ziggurat at Ur and from similar platforms at Nippur, Uruk and Eridu. Their primary instrument was patience. A single observation of the moon's position tells you very little. 100 observations recorded across multiple years and compared against each other begin to reveal the underlying period. 1,000 observations spanning multiple generations of observers, each trained in the same notation system and depositing their records in the same temple archive, allow you to average out the irregularities and arrive at something approaching the true value. The Sumerians had the institutional continuity to do exactly this in temples that persisted for centuries. Scribal schools that transmitted both the technique and the habit of recording, and a theological framework that made celestial observation not a leisure activity, but a priestly obligation with consequences for royal policy, agricultural timing, and the interpretation of divine intentions. They watched because they believed the sky was speaking, and in watching so carefully for so long they heard things the sky actually says. The Mul.Apn tablets, which survive in copies from around 1000 BCE, but are understood to preserve observations from considerably earlier, constitute something close to a comprehensive astronomy manual. They catalogue 66 stars and constellations organised by their heliacal rising dates throughout the year, the moments when a star first becomes visible above the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a period of invisibility during which it travelled too close to the sun to be seen. These dates function as a sidereal calendar anchoring agricultural seasons to stellar positions in a way that remains accurate across centuries, because the stars' apparent motions are consistent. The tablets also describe planetary movements with a specificity that modern astronomers have verified against computational models of the ancient sky, the retrograde loops of Mars, the stations of Jupiter, the complex dual appearance of Venus as both morning and evening stars separated by periods of invisibility that the Sumerians tracked to within a fraction of a day. The Venus tablet of Amsa-Duqa, dating in its surviving form to the Old Babylonian period, but recording observations from the reign of a king whose dates place the original date of the somewhere around 1600 BC, logs 21 years of Venus appearances and disappearances. It notes for each cycle the date of first visibility as morning star, the duration of visibility, the date of disappearance, the length of the invisible period, and the date of reappearance as the evening star. Modern analysis of these records confirms that the dates and durations are generally accurate. Not perfect because atmospheric conditions and the human eye introduce variability, but accurate in the way that long-term averaged observation produces accuracy. The errors distribute themselves around the true value rather than accumulating in a single direction. Someone was watching Venus every clear morning and evening for at least 21 years, recording each appearance with sufficient care that the record remained useful for astrological purposes and remains verifiable for astronomical purposes more than 3 millennia later. The precision accumulates in ways that become difficult to set aside. The Sumerians calculated the solar year at 365.2422 days. The figure accepted today is 365.2422 days. They track the 18.6-year lunar nodal cycle, the slow wobble in the moon's orbital plane that causes its rising and setting points to shift gradually along the horizon over nearly 2 decades before returning to their original positions. Identifying this cycle requires continuous observation across a minimum of 2 full nodal periods, beds, roughly 37 years of nightly records before the pattern becomes unambiguous. The Sumerians not only identified it, but incorporated it into their eclipse prediction methods, using it to calculate which full moons were geometrically positioned for the Earth's shadow to fall on the moon's face. Their eclipse predictions preserved in the omen literature are not uniformly accurate. The system had limits, but they demonstrate that the underlying model was structurally correct. They had grasped the mechanics without, as far as the surviving record shows, ever articulating them in geometric terms. Re-hook contradiction. In 2008, 2 engineers at Bristol University, Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel, published an analysis of a circular clay tablet in the British Museum's collection catalogued as AK8538, which had been classified since the 1880s as an Assyrian astronomical text of moderate interest. Their conclusion was that the tablet depicted the night sky over Mesopotamia on the specific date of June 29, 3123 BC, and recorded the observed trajectory of a large bolide, an asteroid or a cometary fragment travelling northwest, before impacting somewhere in the Austrian Alps. Professional astronomers and Assyriologists have been skeptical the tablet is damaged, the cuneiform star name identifications are contested, and the proposed impact site at Kufels shows geological features that do not match the expected signatures of an aerial burst or ground strike. The interpretation may be wrong in its specifics, but the tablet was copied and preserved for at least 2,400 years before ending up in Nineveh's Royal Library, which means whoever maintained it across those centuries believed it recorded something worth keeping. What that something was, a routine astronomical observation, an exceptional event, a trajectory calculation the tablet does not declare. The astronomical record taken as a whole presents a coherent picture of a civilization that invested enormous institutional resources in watching the sky with methodical care over timescales that individual lifetimes could not span. The mainstream explanation for the precision this produced is entirely adequate. Dedicate enough observers across enough generations to a sufficiently consistent notation system, and the sky will eventually yield its periods to anyone who asks carefully enough. What that explanation does not address is why the Sumerians themselves, in every text that touches on the origins of astronomical knowledge, described it not as something their predecessors had worked out, but as something Enki had given. The third trace we follow does not stay in Mesopotamia. It moves outward to the places where the same memory appears to have arrived by different roads, the same water remembered differently. The reasonable position is that humans everywhere experienced floods, and humans everywhere made myths about them, and the parallels between those myths tell us more about how human minds construct narrative under extreme stress than about any shared event or shared source. This position is held by serious scholars across anthropology, comparative religion, and cognitive science, and it is not a position arrived at carelessly. It rests on genuine observation. When communities face catastrophic inundation, they do tend to remember it in structurally similar ways, foregrounding survival, divine causation, and the restoration of order afterward. The pattern in this reading is a feature of human psychology meeting a recurring physical event, not a signature of contact between distant peoples or transmission of a single original account. That explanation should be held with genuine respect. It accounts for a great deal of what the record shows. What it does not fully account for is the degree of structural specificity that persists across flood narratives separated by oceans and millennia. The Sumerian account of Ziusudra, the Babylonian account of Utnapishtim, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical account of Noah, the Hindu account of Manu, the Greek account of Deucalion, the Aegean flood of Boeotian tradition. These share not merely the broad outline of catastrophic water and a surviving vessel, but a sequence of specific narrative elements that appears in the same order across traditions with no documented contact. A deity or council of deities decides to destroy humanity. One figure receives advance warning delivered privately in some versions through a dream, and in others through direct communication. The warned figure constructs a vessel to specific dimensions, loads it with family and animals, and survives while everything outside perishes. When the waters begin to recede, birds are sent forward to test for dry land in the Sumerian, Babylonian, and biblical versions. The sequence moves from a bird that does not return to a bird that returns with evidence of vegetation to a bird that does not return because it has found land and stayed. The survivor makes an offering. The deity smells it and is moved by it. A covenant or promise is made about the future. The bird sequence is worth pausing on specifically because it's not the kind of detail that independent invention readily explains. Sending birds forward to test for land is a practical technique, and any survivor on a flood vessel might plausibly attempt it. But the specific progression of first bird that fails a second, that returns with a sign, and a third that does not return, appears across the Mesopotamian Hebrew and certain South Asian traditions in the same order, with the same interpretive logic attached to each stage. If these traditions were independently constructing a flood narrative from a shared human experience, there is no particular reason the bird sequence should be identical. There are many ways to describe testing for land. This way, this specific three-stage progression travels across cultural boundaries as though it were part of the story, rather than a detail invented locally to fill a narrative gap. Anthropologists have catalogued more than 200 flood myths from cultures distributed across every inhabited continent. The structural core divine decision human survival vessel birds offering covenant appears with remarkable consistency across traditions that demonstrably had no contact with each other. The Hopi emergence narratives describe a world destroyed by water after human behavior disrupted the relationship between people and the beings responsible for maintaining the world's order. The survivors emerged into a new world through a specific aperture guided by a figure who had been warned in advance. The Andean tradition preserved in the Huarochiri manuscript written down in the late 16th century from oral sources that predate Spanish contact describes a llama who warned its owner 5 days in advance of a coming flood, and the family survived by climbing to a high mountain where the waters could not reach. The structural skeleton advance warning survival through specific preparation restoration afterward persists even when every cultural detail surrounding it is entirely local. Rehook pattern. Recurrence. The figure who descends from the sky to teach humanity also recurs with a consistency that the parallel invention explanation must work harder to address. The Mesopotamian Enki distributes the the cultural arts to human cities. The Egyptian Thoth teaches writing, mathematics, and the calendar. The Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl arrives from across the water and teaches agriculture, calendar keeping, and the arts of civilization before departing and promising to return. The Dogon people of Mali describe beings called the Nomo who descended in a vessel that spun as it descended and landed in water, and who brought with them knowledge of agriculture, social organization, and the structure of the cosmos. Each of these figures belongs completely to its own cultural tradition, the iconography, the associated mythology. The ritual practice surrounding each one is entirely distinct. What they share is a function, an outside intelligence arriving and transmitting knowledge that the recipient culture then preserves as foundational. The mainstream response is that culture heroes are a universal feature of human mythology precisely because innovation feels from the inside like it arrives from outside. A person who develops a new technique for irrigation or metallurgy may over generations of oral transmission become a figure who descended from the sky because the knowledge they brought changed the world in ways that felt like gifts from a different order of reality. This is a psychologically sophisticated explanation, and it is probably correct for many, perhaps most of the culture hero traditions that survive. The question it leaves partially open is whether the mechanism of mythologization, real human innovation gradually transcribed into divine gift, can account for all of the specific convergences, or whether some portion of the pattern reflects something transmitted rather than independently generated. The cross-cultural evidence does not resolve into a single answer. It presents a landscape of parallels that are too consistent to dismiss and too distributed to source with confidence. Taken alone, each tradition is explicable. Taken together, the accumulated weight of structural repetition across languages and continents and centuries constitutes a pattern that continues to sit uneasily in the space between coincidence and connection. We set the three traces beside each other now for the first time and see what shape they make when viewed together. Three traces, one shape. What would it look like if an ancient civilization was trying to preserve something it could not fully explain in the vocabulary available to it? Not inventing, not mythologizing in the loose sense of the word, but recording as accurately as its notation systems allowed information whose origin it had inherited rather than derived. The question is not rhetorical. It has a specific shape in the archaeological record, and that shape becomes visible only when the three traces examined in the preceding chapters are placed alongside each other and read not as separate bodies of evidence but as aspects of a single problem. Each trace taken in isolation permits a comfortable explanation. The creation account reflects theological imagination. The astronomical precision reflects institutional patience. The cross-cultural parallels reflect shared human psychology, encountering shared physical events. These explanations are individually sound. What becomes harder to sustain when the three are held together in the same frame is the assumption that they are unrelated. The first trace, the Atrahasis creation account and its companion texts, establish that the Sumerians described the origin of humanity through a procedure rather than a pronouncement. Materials were specified, a source was named, failures were enumerated in sequence before a working outcome was recorded. The text treats the creation of human beings with the same administrative thoroughness the Sumerians applied to temple inventories and property records, and it does so across multiple surviving copies in both Sumerian and Akkadian, across a span of transmission that runs from at least 2000 to 400 BCE to the final centuries of cuneiform literacy. The consistency of the core narrative across that transmission is itself significant. Details shift at the margins, names vary slightly. The number of failed prototypes is not always identical. The identity of the sacrificed god changes in some versions, but the structural elements are stable: divine labor, problem, council decision, material, procedure, iterative failure, viable result. That stability suggests the scribes who copied these texts understood them as records of something specific, not as poetry, to be adapted freely according to the aesthetic preferences of each generation. The second trace, the astronomical record, established that the Sumerians possessed measurements of celestial periods whose accuracy matches modern instrumentation to within margins that imply either extraordinary long-term observational discipline or access to a knowledge base that compressed what would otherwise require centuries of data collection. The institutional explanation for this precision is the strongest available temples with a multi-generational continuity as scribal schools, with consistent notation and a theological framework that made nightly skywatching a mandatory priestly function. All of this is real and should not be minimized, but the Sumerians themselves, in every text that addresses the question of where this knowledge came from, gave the same answer. Enki distributed it. Then we included astronomical understanding as a discrete transferable item, not as an emergent achievement. The civilization that produced some of the most careful empirical records in the ancient world consistently described those records' foundations as received rather than earned. The third traced the cross-cultural parallels in flood narrative and sky-descending teacher figures, established that certain structural elements of the Sumerian account appear in traditions geographically and temporally separated from Mesopotamia by distances that make direct textual transmission difficult to argue. The three-stage bird sequence in flood narratives, the culture hero arriving from outside with foundational knowledge and departing under specific conditions, the iterative creation attempt that fails before succeeding. These elements appear across South Asia, Mesoamerica, West Africa, and the ancient Mediterranean in forms that share the structural skeleton while wearing entirely different cultural skin. The parallel invention explanation handles this adequately for any individual pairing. What it handles less comfortably is the full distribution, the appearance of the same specific narrative mechanisms in traditions that have no other documented points of contact and no obvious reason to converge on the identical procedural sequences when constructing their foundational stories. Rehook micro fact. The Sumerian king list records that after the flood, the first post-Diluvian king to reign in Kish was assigned a reign of 1,200 years. The second was given 960, the third 900. The sequence continues downward in irregular but consistent decline until the reigns reach durations that match the archaeological record of actual rulers whose palaces have been excavated and whose inscriptions have been found. The list does not mark the transition between mythological and historical time. It simply continues as though the scribe recording it saw no categorical boundary between a king who reigned for 1,200 years and a king who reigned for 25. What the three traces share when placed together is a consistent orientation towards specificity and context, where other ancient traditions chose generality. Other cultures made gods. The Sumerians made administrators with offices and territories. Other cultures described creation through divine breath or spoken word. The Sumerians described a mixing procedure with enumerated failures. Other cultures preserved flood memories. The Sumerians preserved a flood memory with a bird sequence so specific that it reappears in the same order in texts written 1,000 years later on the other side of the Fertile Crescent. Other cultures developed astronomical traditions. The Sumerians developed astronomical traditions and then attributed them to a specific divine figure who held them as discrete transferable objects that could be stolen on a boat. The convergence does not prove a shared source. It does not establish that the Anunnaki were anything other than theological constructs serving the social functions that theological constructs have always served. What it establishes is a pattern of specificity that runs through each of the three traces and connects them at a level below their surface content, a habit of recording that looks less like the elaboration of symbol and more like the preservation of detail maintained across centuries of copying by people who may no longer have understood what they were preserving but understood that it should not be changed. The shape the three traces make held together is not the shape of myth freely invented. It is the shape of something being carefully kept. Whether what was being kept was true in any sense we can now verify is a question the clay does not answer. What the clay does consistently across 15 centuries of a civilization's recorded life is hold the account steady and pass it forward. We look now at the strongest arguments against reading that steadiness as meaningful, because those arguments deserve the same careful attention as the evidence that prompted the question. What the careful mind objects. Before the pattern is carried further, it deserves to be tested. The three traces examined so far have been presented with the seriousness they warrant, but seriousness requires that the strongest objections receive the same treatment as the evidence that generated them. The case against reading the Sumerian material as anything other than theology mythology and accumulated observational skill is not a case made from incuriosity. It is made from the same careful engagement with the same text by scholars who have spent careers inside the cuneiform tradition and who find the alternative interpretations not merely unproven but structurally misconceived. Those objections deserve a fair hearing, stated as their proponents would state them not as a formality to be dispatched, but as a genuine check on where the evidence actually reaches. The first and most fundamental objection concerns the creation account. The Atrahasis narrative with its procedural language and its sequence of failed prototypes has been read in this episode as unusually specific, more like a record than like poetry. But the Assyriologist's response to this reading is precise. The Sumerians were not unusual in their literalism. They were unusual in their administrative culture, and the procedural quality of the text reflects that culture's cognitive habits, rather than the preservation of a technical document. Every element of the creation narrative that appears striking to a modern reader, the named materials, the enumerated failures, the social assignments for each defective prototype, maps onto the Sumerians' well-documented tendency to explain all domains of existence through the same organizational logic they applied to grain storage and labor allocation. They theologized the way they administered. The procedural texture of the Atrahasis account is in this reading evidence of Sumerian literary character, not evidence of an underlying technical reality. The objection is sound. It cannot be dismissed by pointing to the strangeness of the text, because the text is only strange if you expect ancient creation literature to sound like Greek or Hebrew creation literature. The Sumerians were not Greeks or Hebrews. They were administrators, and their creation story sounds like one. What this objection does not fully dissolve is the question of why the failed prototypes are enumerated at all. If the procedural texture reflects administrative habit, and if the purpose of the myth is to explain human origins and justify human social roles, the 6 failures are not necessary for either function. A single successful creation followed by the distribution of humans to their labours would accomplish the theological and ideological work the narrative is understood to be doing. The failures add nothing to the explanation of hierarchy or divine purpose. They add only the record of what did not work before what did. That specific addition, unnecessary for the myth's social function present anyway, preserved across 15 centuries of copying, is the detail the administrative explanation accounts for least comfortably. The second objection addresses the astronomical precision. The Sumerians' measurements of lunar and planetary periods match modern values to a degree that seems remarkable, but the mainstream position is that this remarkability dissolves when the full institutional picture is considered. Temples with unbroken records spanning centuries, scribal schools transmitting consistent notation across generations, a theological imperative making nightly observation mandatory for trained practitioners with nothing else competing for their attention after dark. Under these conditions, the gradual convergence of averaged observations toward true values is not merely possible, it is mathematically expected. The Maya, working entirely independently on the other side of the planet, achieved comparable precision for the Venus cycle, using comparable methods: long-term observation, systematic recording, and the patient averaging of accumulated data. The argument that Sumerian astronomical precision implies an external source of knowledge is in the mainstream view an argument that underestimates what sustained human attention can produce when given enough time and institutional support. This objection is also sound. It should genuinely reduce the weight placed on the precision argument, because the Maya parallel is real and important. 2 civilizations, no contact, comparable results. The method works. What it leaves open is narrower, but not trivial. The Maya developed their astronomical tradition over a documented period with intermediate stages of development visible in the archaeological record. The Sumerian astronomical tradition appears in the earliest written texts already at a level of sophistication that implies a prior development period of comparable length, but that prior period, if it existed, left no written record because writing had not yet been invented. The tradition's foundations are by definition archaeologically invisible. Whether those foundations were laid by generations of pre-literate Sumerian observers or arrived through some other channel is a question the record cannot answer, because the record begins only when writing begins, which is precisely when the tradition is already advanced. Re-hook skeptic whisper. The third objection is perhaps the strongest, and it concerns the cross-cultural parallels. The argument that flood myths worldwide reflect independent responses to independent flooding events is supported by genuine geological evidence. Sea levels rose approximately 120 meters over several millennia at the end of the last ice age, inundating coastal settlements across every inhabited continent. Every culture that lived near water experienced catastrophic flooding at some point in its history. The structural similarities between flood narratives may reflect not shared memory of a single event, but shared human narrative logic applied to a shared type of experience. Survivors thank the forces they believe govern existence. They describe what they did to survive. They record what they lost. The specific elements that appear consistent across traditions, the vessel, the birds, the offering, may be consistent because they are the practical and psychological responses that flood survival actually generates, not because they were transmitted from a common source. This is a serious argument, and it is probably correct for a significant portion of the parallel material. What it handles less cleanly is the 3-stage bird sequence, specifically which is not a practical response to flooding, but a narrative choice about how to represent the testing for land. There are many ways to describe that testing. The consistent choice of a 3-stage progression failure, partial success, complete success across traditions with no other documented points of contact suggests either that this particular narrative structure is somehow universally intuitive to human minds constructing flood survival stories, or that it travelled. Which of these is true, the current evidence does not decide. The pattern remains open. not confirmed as transmission, not dismissed as coincidence, genuinely as of now unresolved. We carry that unresolved state forward into the next chapter where the question changes shape without becoming simpler. What remains after the objections have done their work? In the reading room of the British Museum's Middle East department under fluorescent light that flattens everything to the same institutional grey, a curator holds a tablet fragment between two fingers and tilts it toward the lamp. The cuneiform on its surface is shallow, pressed by a stylus held at a shallow angle. The wedge is barely deeper than a fingernail scratch, and the light must catch it at precisely the right angle before the signs become legible. The fragment is from Nippur. It dates to somewhere around 2100 BCE. It is one of perhaps 40,000 tablets in the museum's collection that have been catalogued but not yet fully published, meaning that the text it carries has been read by perhaps 2 or 3 specialists in the century since it was excavated, and its relationship to the larger corpus of Sumerian literature remains for now a matter of partial understanding. The curator tilts the tablet once more, finds the angle, reads, and sets it down. Whatever it says joins the slow accumulation of material that the field processes at the rate that careful scholarship allows, which is to say gradually and completely with constant awareness of how much remains. This image is worth holding for a moment because it is the actual condition of our knowledge of the Sumerian material. The objections laid out in the preceding chapter are real, and they carry genuine weight, but they operate on the portion of the record that has been translated, analysed, and situated within the broader corpus. Roughly 80% of the cuneiform tablets currently held in museums worldwide have not been published with full translations. Many have not been read since excavation. The field's conclusions, including the conclusions that support the mainstream interpretive framework, are conclusions drawn from a fraction of the available evidence, and that fraction was not selected randomly. It was selected by the accidents of excavation, the priorities of 19th century collectors, and the institutional resources available to 20th century scholarship. What the unread tablets contain, whether they confirm or complicate or simply add texture to what the published corpus has established, is genuinely unknown. This does not validate any particular alternative interpretation. The absence of evidence from unread tablets is not evidence for anything except incompleteness, but it is a reminder that the mainstream consensus, however well grounded in the material it has examined, rests on a sample rather than a totality, and that the confidence appropriate to a consensus built on 80% of the available material is not the same confidence appropriate to one built on everything. The objections in Chapter 6 are sound within the scope of what is known. They are also necessarily partial constructed from the same incomplete record they are used to adjudicate. What survives the objections then is worth stating precisely. The administrative culture explanation for the procedural quality of the Atrahasis account is well reasoned, and probably correct in its general claim that the Sumerians' cognitive habits shaped their theological language. What it does not dissolve is the presence of the 6 enumerated failures which serve no mythological function that a single successful creation would not equally serve, and which are preserved unchanged in their basic structure across every surviving copy of the text. The long-term observation explanation for Sumerian astronomical precision is well reasoned and supported by the Maya parallel. What it cannot address is the invisibility of the tradition's developmental stages, the pre-literate period during which those centuries of accumulated observation would have been occurring, because that period left no record by definition, and an argument from institutional continuity applied to an archaeologically invisible foundation is at minimum an argument that cannot be confirmed rather than one that has been confirmed. The shared psychology explanation for cross-cultural flood parallels is well reasoned and probably correct for the broad structural similarities between flood narratives globally. What it handles least comfortably is the 3-stage bird sequence, which is not a psychologically necessary feature of flood survival narrative, but a specific procedural choice that appears in the same order across traditions with no documented contact. Re-hook contradiction. The Sumerian king list was not the only ancient document to record dramatically extended human lifespans in antediluvian periods. The genealogical sections of Genesis assign pre-flood patriarchs lifespans between 700 and 969 years, with a consistent downward trend after the flood, until the numbers approach the historically familiar range. The Mahabharata's descriptions of earlier cosmic ages assign human lifespans proportional to the moral quality of each age, with the longest lives belonging to the most distant past. The pattern of extreme longevity in the distant past declining across generations toward contemporary norms appears in traditions from Mesopotamia to South Asia to the ancient Mediterranean, without any of those traditions appearing to have borrowed the specific declining structure from each other. Whether this convergence reflects a shared symbolic logic about moral and temporal decline, or preserves a fragmented memory of something biological that actually changed the text do not say. They simply record the numbers and move on the way. Administrators record figures they were given rather than figures they derived. What the recovery from the skeptic chapter requires is not a refutation of the objections they stand within their scope, but a recalibration of what the evidence is actually being asked to support. The three traces do not require the Anunnaki to have been extraterrestrial visitors. They do not require genetic engineering in any literal sense. They do not require a single Ur flood event that all 200 traditions are independently remembering. What they require minimally is that the Sumerian material be read with the same epistemic openness applied to any other ancient record whose implications are not yet fully worked out, which is to say, with the acknowledgement that the most parsimonious explanation for each individual element may not be the most accurate explanation for the pattern formed by all of them together. Parsimony applied locally can obscure structure visible only at a larger scale. The three traces held together after the objections have done their work still make a shape that the available explanations account for only partially. We extend the frame now outward from Mesopotamia to examine what that shape looks like when the geography widens and the time depth increases. The same architecture, different rivers. At the moment the sun clears the horizon over the Indus plain, the light arrives flat and lateral, moving across a landscape so level that shadows stretch for hundreds of meters before the heat of the day shortens them to nothing. The city of Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan was built on this plain sometime around 2600 BCE, contemporary with Ur at its height, contemporary with the early Egyptian Old Kingdom, contemporary with the phase of Sumerian civilization that produced the most complete surviving versions of the creation texts. The light this morning falls on mounds of eroded mud brick that archaeologists have been excavating with varying degrees of continuity since 1922. What they have found beneath those mounds constitutes one of the most precisely planned urban environments in the ancient world, a city laid out on a grid with streets intersecting at right angles, a sophisticated drainage system running beneath the residential blocks, standardized brick sizes used consistently across the entire settlement, and a citadel district elevated above the lower city on a raised platform that has drawn inevitable comparisons to the temple platforms of Mesopotamia. Mohenjo-Daro housed perhaps 40,000 people at its peak. Its script has not been deciphered. We do not know what its inhabitants called their city, their gods, or themselves. The Indus Valley civilization, Harappan culture, as archaeologist Shoakanasut name it, after the site where it was first identified, extended across an area larger than Mesopotamia and Egypt combined at its maximum extent, encompassing more than 1,000 settlements from the Afghan foothills to the Gujarat coast. Its standardization is what strikes engineers and archaeologists most forcefully. Brick sizes across the entire civilization follow a ratio of 1:4 width to height to length, maintained with sufficient consistency that a brick produced in a settlement near the Himalayan foothills fits the same construction module as one produced near the Arabian Sea, hundreds of kilometers away. The weights and measures used in Harappan commerce follow a binary and decimal system of extraordinary precision, with stone cubes that increase by factors of 2 up to 16, then shift to decimal multiples, a system so internally consistent that it implies either a central authority maintaining standards or a shared metrological tradition transmitted with unusual fidelity across vast distances. The same brick ratio 1:4 appears in Mesopotamian construction during the same period. Whether this reflects contact between the two civilizations, and there is evidence of trade with Indus seals found at Mesopotamian sites and vice versa, or independent convergence on an optimal solution to a common construction problem, the current record does not resolve. What the Harappan civilization adds to the frame established in the preceding chapters is a third simultaneous instance of the same general pattern. A complex urban civilization emerging in a compressed period with a level of organizational sophistication that implies either a long developmental prehistory or an unusually rapid acquisition of foundational knowledge. The Harappan cities do not show the gradual growth from small village to large settlement that the standard developmental model predicts. They appear in the archaeological stratigraphy relatively quickly, already equipped with grid planning, standardized construction, and centralized infrastructure management. The pre-Harappan settlements of the Mehrgarh region show an earlier agricultural tradition stretching back to around 7000 BCE, which provides the population base. What they do not clearly show is the intermediate urbanistic development that should, in the standard model, bridge the gap between Mehrgarh-scale villages and Mohenjo-Daro-scale cities. Rehook map shift. In the Egyptian Old Kingdom, beginning around 2700 BCE, the divine council that governed the cosmos was called the Ennead Nine Gods, whose relationships, territories, and jurisdictions were mapped with the same organizational specificity the Sumerians applied to the Anunnaki. Atum held primacy, Shu and Tefnut governed air and moisture, Geb and Nut held earth and sky, Osiris Isis, Mars, and Nephthys administered the domains of rule, magic, disorder, and protection respectively. Like the Anunnaki, these were not abstract theological principles, but beings with specific homes, specific appetites, specific histories of conflict and resolution. Like the Anunnaki, they were held to have been physically present in the world during an earlier age. The Zep Tepi the first time before withdrawing to a more distant relationship with human affairs. The Egyptian Divine Council and the Sumerian Anunnaki are not the same tradition. Their mythologies diverge at almost every specific point, but they share an organizational structure, governing body of distinct fine administrators, holding specific domains whose presence in the world is located in the distant past rather than the present that appears in both civilizations at approximately the same historical moment. The geographic expansion does not strengthen any single interpretation of the Sumerian material. What it does is complicate the explanatory task. The developmental explanation for Sumerian civilization, population threshold, agricultural surplus, organizational necessity is a local explanation that works reasonably well within the Mesopotamian frame. Applied to the Harappan civilization simultaneously, it requires an independent parallel development occurring at approximately the same historical moment on a different river system with a different cultural background. Applied to the Egyptian Old Kingdom simultaneously, it requires a third independent parallel. Each instance individually is explicable. The three together, emerging within a few centuries of each other, across the breadth of the ancient world's most populated region, constitute a clustering that the developmental model addresses, by noting that similar environmental pressures produce similar solutions, but that response grows somewhat thinner each time it is applied to another instance of the same patterns appearing in the same narrow window of time. The Sumerians described the Mi as objects Enki held before distributing them to the cities. Writing mathematics, the arts of construction and governance, all of them held in one place before being sent outward. The image is organizational, a central repository, then distribution. Whether that image reflects a theological metaphor for the diffusion of cultural innovation through trade and migration or preserves the memory of something more literal, the record does not say. What the record shows is a world in which the foundational technologies of complex civilization, standardized measurement, grid, urbanism, astronomical calendrics, divine council, governance appear across multiple river valleys within a span of time that is brief by the standards of the evolutionary processes that preceded it. The shape the evidence makes viewed from this wider frame is not the shape of the independent parallel development so much as the shape of something propagating. What propagated and from where, and whether it had a single point of origin or emerged from a network of exchange we have not yet fully mapped, remains the question the expansion opens rather than closes. We carry it into the chapter where the evidence reaches its most concentrated and least explicable point. The numbers that should not be there. The Plimpton 322 tablet sits in the collection of Columbia University acquired in 1922 from a dealer in antiquities, and studied intermittently since then by mathematicians and historians of science who have not reached consensus on what it means. It is a rectangular clay tablet approximately 13 centimeters wide and 9 centimeters tall, damaged at its left edge, where a section is broken away inscribed in Old Babylonian cuneiform sometime around 1800 BCE. What it contains in 15 rows of 4 columns is a table of numbers that, when analysed, constitute a systematically generated list of Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 integers satisfying the relationship that the Greek mathematician Pythagoras would formalise roughly 1,200 years later. The triples on the tablet are not small or obvious ones. They are large, generated according to a method that implies knowledge of an algebraic relationship between numbers that standard histories of mathematics place in the Greek classical period. The tablet does not explain itself. It does not name the relationship it is exploiting. It simply presents the results in a table organised with the quiet confidence of a document recording something its author considered unremarkable. The Plimpton 322 is not an isolated anomaly in Mesopotamian mathematics. The corpus of old Babylonian mathematical tablets, most of them excavated from school contexts at Nippur, and other sites include solutions to quadratic equations, calculations of square and cube roots, compound interest problems requiring iterative approximation, and geometric calculations whose underlying methods were not formally articulated in the Western mathematical tradition until the medieval Islamic period. The Babylonian mathematicians who produced these tablets were working, as far as the archaeological record shows, without symbolic algebra, without a zero as a positional placeholder, and without any of the formal proof structures that Greek mathematics would later develop. They solved problems by procedure, a sequence of operations applied to specific numbers, and their procedures work. Applied correctly, they produce accurate results for problems whose underlying mathematical structure was not named or formalized until millennia later. The procedures exist before the theory that would explain why they work. What makes this pattern sit differently from simple mathematical precocity is its relationship to the base 60 number system the Sumerians used. The choice of 60 as a mathematical base is not arbitrary, and it is not obvious. 10 is obvious. It matches the fingers on 2 hands, and virtually every culture that counts independently arrives at base 10 or base 5 as its primary system. 60 has no anatomical correlate. It is chosen if it is chosen on mathematical grounds, because 60 has more divisors than any smaller number. It divides evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30 and 60 itself, making fractions far more manageable than they are in base 10. This is a sophisticated mathematical reason, but it is a reason that becomes apparent only after sustained engagement with the problems that fractions create in practical calculation. The Sumerians used base 60 from the earliest period of their written record without any surviving evidence of the simpler systems that should, in the developmental model, have preceded it. We use it still 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, because the Babylonian astronomical tradition transmitted it to Greek astronomy, which transmitted it to the Islamic world, which transmitted it to medieval Europe, which gave it to the modern scientific tradition. The most fundamental unit of our timekeeping is a Sumerian artifact, and we do not know why the Sumerians chose it. The king list's numbers, when examined through the base 60 system, reveal an internal structure that random, mythological inflation would not be expected to produce. The antediluvian reign lengths, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, 21,000 years are all multiples of 3,600, which is the Sumerian Shah, the unit representing 60 squared. The total of 241,200 years is likewise a precise multiple of the Shah. Scholars have noted this for decades without reaching agreement on what it implies. One interpretation is that the reign lengths are astronomical periods encoded in regnal form, the Shah being a unit that appears in astronomical contexts, and the specific multiples chosen corresponding to cycles of observable celestial phenomena. Another is that the numbers were simply constructed to appear impressive, using the largest culturally significant unit available. The way a storyteller might say 1,000 years without meaning, a literal 1,000. Both explanations are available. What neither explains is why the numbers are internally consistent multiples rather than approximate round figures. A storyteller reaching for impressiveness would say 30,000 years or 40,000 years. The king list says 28,800, which is 8 times 3,600, and 36,000, which is 10 times 3,600, with the same precision a scribe would use when recording a grain shipment. The numbers are not poetic. They are calculated. Rehook pattern recurrence. Human chromosome. 2. The second largest chromosome in the human genome carries at its center a sequence of telomeric DNA, the kind of DNA that normally appears only at chromosome tips flanking two fused centromeres, where two separate chromosomes appear to have been joined end-to-end at some point in the human lineage's past. In all other great apes, the genetic material carried on human chromosome 2 is distributed across two separate chromosomes. In humans, it is one. The fusion is understood by geneticists as a genuine historical event, a chromosomal joining that occurred in a single individual or a small founding population and spread through inheritance. The event is not disputed scientifically. The chromosome carries the evidence of the fusion in its own structure. What remains a matter of investigation rather than settled conclusion is the precise timing, the population context, and whether the fusion event was accompanied by any detectable change in the capabilities of the individuals who carried it. The Sumerians could not have known about chromosomes. They did not have microscopes, they did not have a concept of genetic inheritance in any molecular sense. And the connection between the chromosome 2 fusion and the Atrahasis creation account is not a connection the tablets draw explicitly. What the tablets draw explicitly is a description of combining divine genetic material with terrestrial material to produce a new kind of being, and what the genome carries visibly is evidence of a fusion event in human chromosomal history that distinguishes us from every other great ape, and that occurred, as best current dating suggests, within the last few 100,000 years. The coincidence may be exactly that. The alternative that the Sumerian scribes were preserving in the only vocabulary available to a Bronze Age civilization, a description of a biological event whose molecular mechanism they could not have grasped, is not provable from the available evidence. It is, however, a hypothesis the evidence does not rule out. That distinction between not proven and not ruled out is the precise location where this chapter leaves the question. The peak is here. Everything that follows descends from it toward wider ground and quieter contemplation, the view from a sufficient distance. The peak passed in the previous chapter leaves a particular quality of silence behind it. When evidence reaches its most concentrated and least explicable point, and the chapter closes without resolving, what it opened, the mind does something that the argumentative mode cannot. It steps back, and in stepping back it sees the shape of the whole rather than the texture of the parts. This is the chapter for that distance. Not for new evidence, not for further traces to be laid alongside the ones already examined, but for the simpler and perhaps more honest act of looking at everything gathered so far and asking what kind of thing it is that we are looking at. Not whether it proves anything, not whether the objections hold, but what the entire body of material held at arm's length actually resembles. What it resembles viewed from sufficient distance is a civilization that consistently faced backward. The Sumerians of the classical period, the priests recording observations at Ur, the scribes copying creation texts at Nippur, the administrators managing temple estates at Lagash, all of them understood their present as a diminished version of a more complete past. The me had been distributed from a central holding. Kingship had descended from heaven and then, after the flood, descended again. The antediluvian kings had reigned for periods that the post-diluvian kings could not approach. The gods had once been present in the cities housed in temples, whose daily rituals were designed to maintain a relationship that the texts suggest had once been more direct, and had become progressively more mediated. The Sumerians did not experience themselves as the culmination of development. They experienced themselves as inheritors of something they were trying to maintain without fully understanding. This orientation backward-facing preservationist, aware of a gap between the present and a more complete past, is not unique to Sumer. It appears in the Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods walked the earth before withdrawing to their current distance. It appears in the Hindu cosmological framework of the Yugas, in which humanity moves through progressively degraded ages from the Golden Satya Yuga to the diminished Kali Yuga of the present. It appears in the Greek tradition of Hesiod's ages, gold, silver, bronze, heroic iron, descending from divine proximity to human isolation. The specific theological content of each tradition is entirely its own. But the underlying orientation is shared. The past was more complete. The present is a partial inheritance, and the work of civilization is largely the work of preservation rather than discovery. A civilization that believes it is preserving rather than discovering will produce a particular kind of record. It will copy texts it no longer fully understands because the texts feel important. It will maintain rituals whose original rationale has been partially lost because discontinuing them seems more dangerous than continuing them without full comprehension. It will transmit numbers it cannot verify because the source that provided them was more authoritative than any source currently available. The Sumerian scribal tradition, with its 15 centuries of conservative textual transmission, its explicit labels noting that a tablet is a copy of an older and often damaged original, its preservation of creation accounts and king list numbers that the scribes themselves may have found difficult to interpret. And all of this looks exactly like what a preservationist civilization produces. Not invention, dressed as memory. Memory maintained past the point of full understanding. Re-hook myth echo. In the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled in the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian king sent agents across his empire with explicit instructions to find, copy, and return any text considered important. The library's catalogue, partially reconstructed from surviving fragments, shows a deliberate effort to collect not merely administrative and omen literature, but the mythological and literary corpus, the creation text, the Gilgamesh epic, the astronomical records. Ashurbanipal himself was literate, which was unusual for ancient kings, and his inscriptions describe his pride in being able to read the difficult pre-flood tablets. That phrase, pre-flood tablets, appears in his own royal inscriptions as a category of document distinguished from ordinary records by its antiquity and its difficulty. The king of one of the ancient world's most powerful empires organized his library around a distinction between ordinary texts and texts from before the flood. Whatever the flood represented, in 7th century Assyrian thought it was real enough as a historical marker to organize a royal archive. The view from distance also reveals something about this relationship between the civilization's explicit claims and its implicit practices. The Sumerians said the gods had made humans to work. Their temple economies operationalized this claim with extraordinary thoroughness, the labor, the offerings, the rations, the administrative structures all flowing from the theological premise that humanity existed in a service relationship with divine beings who required maintenance. But the temple economies also outlasted any living belief in the god's physical presence. By the late Sumerian period, the daily offerings continued not because anyone present had seen a deity consume them, but because the practice had institutional momentum stretching back to a time when the texts implied the relationship had been different. The ritual preserved the form of a connection whose original character had been partially lost. This is what preservation looks like from the inside, maintaining the structure after the full meaning has receded, trusting that the structure contains a more than the current generation can access. The question this distance opens is not whether the Anunnaki were real in any literal sense. It is a quieter question. What was the Sumerian civilization trying to hold on to, and did it succeed? The clay tablets in their museum cases represent the partial answer. The creation account survived. The astronomical record survived. The king list survived. The flood narrative survived and travelled outward into half a dozen other traditions. What the Sumerians chose to preserve, they preserved with considerable fidelity across the full span of their civilization's life. Whether what they were preserving was theology memory, or some category we do not yet have a clean name for, it reached us. It is here. We are the latest generation of people who have read it, and found that reading it changes the quality of the question rather than answering it. The dissolution that follows is not a retreat from the question. It is the question finding its natural form open and held lightly in the dark. What the question becomes when you stop pushing it. What if the most important thing the Sumerians left behind was not an answer, but a posture, not the creation account, not the astronomical tables, not the king list with its impossible numbers, but the orientation itself, the habit of facing backward toward a more complete past, while carefully maintaining the records of what that past claimed to have been. Every civilization that came after them, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, the inheritors of the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition, who carried base 60 arithmetic into the Islamic Golden Age, and from there into the timekeeping systems of the modern world, every one of them received something from the Sumerian preservation effort, without fully knowing the shape of what they had received. We are in a sense that is not metaphorical the latest recipients of a transmission that began in the river plains of southern Iraq somewhere around 3200 BCE, and has not stopped moving since. Whether what was being transmitted was true in a literal sense, whether the Anunnaki existed outside the imagination of the people who wrote about them, is a question that archaeology approaches and philosophy inherits and cosmology eventually absorbs into something larger than either. The archaeological question is bounded. It asks, what does the physical record show and what does it not show, and where is the line between what can be claimed from evidence and what must be acknowledged as speculation? The physical record shows a civilization that emerged with unusual rapidity, maintained its foundational texts with unusual fidelity, produced astronomical measurements of unusual precision, and described its own origins in procedural language that sits uneasily in the category of mythology without fitting cleanly into the category of history. The physical record does not show the Anunnaki. It does not show genetic engineering. It does not show spacecraft or external intervention, or any of the more dramatic elements that popular interpretation has layered onto the Sumerian material over the past half-century. What it shows is the record of the civilization left of what it believed maintained across 15 centuries of institutional effort, and that record is genuinely remarkable without requiring embellishment. The philosophical question is less bounded. It asks, what does it mean that humans in the earliest period for which we have written evidence of their inner lives describe themselves as made for a purpose by beings more capable than themselves, and found this description not tragic but administrative, not degrading but simply accurate? The Atrahasis account does not grieve the condition it describes. There is no Promethean resentment in the Sumerian creation literature, no sense that humanity was cheated of something it deserved. The texts record the creation of humans as a solution to a logistical problem, and then move on to other matters. The people who maintained these texts for 15 centuries, who copied them in schoolrooms and stored them in temple libraries, appear to have found this account of their origins not troubling but stable, a foundation solid enough to build an entire civilization's self-understanding upon. What that stability meant to them, whether it represented a genuine cosmological peace, or simply the normalization of a hierarchy too old and too total to be questioned, is a question the clay preserves without answering. The cosmological question dissolves the boundaries of both the archaeological and the philosophical. It asks, in a universe of the scale and age that we now understand ourselves to inhabit, that roughly 14 billion years old, containing more stars than there are grains of sand on every beach and desert on Earth, what is the probability that the development of complex intelligence happened only once, only here, only in the last 300,000 years of a 14 billion year timeline? The scientific consensus on this question is honest about its uncertainty. We have no confirmed evidence of intelligence elsewhere. We also have no confirmed evidence of its absence. The Drake equation, which attempts to estimate the number of communicating civilizations in the galaxy, returns answers that span many orders of magnitude depending on the values assigned to its variables, because those values are largely unknown. The question is genuinely open in a way that is not equivalent to saying the answer is unknowable. It is open in the way that a question is open when the evidence needed to close it has not yet been gathered. Re-hook. Sensory reset. The night sky above the Iraqi marshes, where the Tigris and Euphrates approach their confluence, is still among the darkest in the inhabited world. The reed beds that Sumerian farmers walked 5,000 years ago still grow at the river's edge, though diminished by decades of drainage and pollution and the slow shifting of water management priorities. On a clear night away from the generator-lit settlements, the Milky Way is visible as a structural feature of the sky, rather than a faint suggestion, a dense band of light containing among its several 100 billion stars, whatever it contains, which we do not yet know. The Sumerian priests who watched that sky from elevated platforms were not watching it with less intelligence than we bring to it now. They were watching it with different instruments, different frameworks, different questions. Their questions produced the Venus tablet, the eclipse predictions, the base 60 mathematics that still structures every clock face on Earth. Our questions have produced the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Telescope, the detection of exoplanets in the habitable zones of distant stars. The two sets of questions separated by 5 millennia are not as discontinuous as they appear. Both are asking, with the tools available, what is up there and what does it mean for what is down here. We will not resolve this tonight, and the not resolving is not a failure. It is the correct response to a question whose scale exceeds what a single night's contemplation or a single civilization's lifetime can contain. Archaeology becomes philosophy when the physical record runs out and the questions it raises continue past the edge of what stones and tablets can answer. Philosophy becomes cosmology when the questions exceed the boundaries of human history and open outward into the structure of existence itself, into the age of the universe, the distribution of matter, the probability of minds arising in the dark and looking up and wondering what looked back. The Sumerians stood at the beginning of the written record and faced that question with the directness of people who believed they already knew the partial answer. We stand near the end of what the written record has so far produced and face the same question with the humility of people who know how much remains unknown. The distance between those two positions may be smaller than it appears from inside either one. The clay that carries the tablets forward into the chapter that closes this night holds one last image, specific, physical, small enough to fit in two hands. The tablet in the sealed room, in the basement storage of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in a climate-controlled room whose temperature is maintained at 18 degrees Celsius, regardless of what the desert above it is doing. There are tablets that have not been read since the scribes who wrote them set them down, not unread since excavation, unread since composition. They were written stored in the temple archive they belonged to, buried when the building collapsed or burned, and transferred eventually through the long chain of excavation and cataloguing and institutional custody to the drawer where they now sit. The cuneiform on their surfaces is legible to the small number of scholars who read Old Babylonian or Sumerian fluently. The tablets wait as they have always waited for the attention that the sheer volume of surviving material has not yet allowed them to receive. They are not unusual objects in themselves. They are unremarkable members of a very large collection. What makes them worth holding in the mind at the close of this night's account is the simple fact of their patience, not as a metaphor for anything but as a physical reality. Clay pressed into shape 5,000 years ago retains the impression of the stylus that pressed it. The hand that held that stylus is gone. The city the scribe walked through every morning is a mound of eroded brick rising from flat desert. The language the scribe spoke to his students and his children has not been anyone's native tongue for 4,000 years, and the marks remain clear and readable, carrying whatever they carry into a present their maker could not have imagined. This is the image the night ends on. Not the grandeur of the ziggurats, not the precision of the astronomical tables, not the unsettling procedural language of the creation accounts, but this a small rectangle of fired clay in a tomb, in a drawer, in a basement, in a city built over a civilization that believed it had been made by beings who came from the sky. The image is specific and it is ordinary, and it contains in its ordinariness everything the preceding 11 chapters have been circling. The Sumerians were not trying to be mysterious, they were trying to be clear. They wrote things down because they believed the things they were writing mattered, and they maintained those writings across centuries because the belief did not diminish with the passing of the generations that had originally formed it. Whatever they understood about their own origins, whether that understanding was theological or memorial or some category of knowing that our current vocabulary does not cleanly accommodate, they considered it worth the institutional effort of preservation. The tablet in the drawer is the residue of that effort. It is also, in some sense, its success. The three traces followed through this night converge here at the level of the object rather than the argument. The creation account survives because scribes in schools copied it onto tablets that were baked when the schools burned and preserved when the ruins were excavated. The astronomical precision survives because priests on elevated platforms recorded their nightly observations on clay that outlasted the platforms and the priests and the theology that motivated the watching. The cross-cultural parallels survive because the same impulse that drove Sumerian scribes to maintain their records drove the compilers of Sanskrit epics and Mesoamerican codices and oral traditions carried across land bridges and ocean passages, the impulse to hold something to pass it forward, to trust that the next generation and the generation after that would find in the preserved material something worth having received. The clay is only the Sumerian version of this universal human act. Every culture that survived long enough to leave a record left it in the material most durable and most available: stonebark, skin wax, papyrus paper, magnetic charge on spinning metal discs. The medium changes, the impulse does not. The hook mesum act detail. The colophon, the scribal note appended to the end of a copied tablet, often records not just the name of the scribe and the date of copying, but the condition of the source material. Tablets are described as old, as damaged, as difficult to read in certain passages. Some colophons note that the scribe could not make out a section and left it blank rather than guess at what it said. This honesty about incompleteness preserved in the margins of documents that were themselves attempts at preservation carries a particular quality across the millennia. The scribe knew the limits of what could be recovered. He recorded those limits alongside the text itself, trusting whoever came next to understand that a gap in the account was not an error, but an acknowledgement: this much we have, this much we could not reach, we pass both to you. We are the whoever came next that those scribes were writing toward without knowing it. The gap they marked is still there. The text surrounding it is still there. And the question the text raises, what the Sumerians were preserving and from where, and whether the answer to that question would change our understanding of what we are and where we came from, is still there, sitting in the same relationship to the available evidence that it has occupied for 150 years of scholarship and debate. Not proof, a pattern made from the specific gravity of small consistent details maintained across long chains of transmission by people who considered the maintenance worth the effort. The pattern does not resolve into certainty. It resolves into the kind of question that a civilization leaves for the next one, not a problem to be solved so much as an orientation to be inherited, a direction to face when the noise of the present grows too loud and something older and quieter reasserts itself. The tablet in the drawer contains whatever it contains. The desert above the Iraq Museum is the same desert that covered the Library of Nippur for 2,000 years before anyone knew to look for it. The stars above that desert are the same stars the priests logged from ziggurat platforms, their positions unchanged in any way that would have been perceptible across a human lifetime, their cycles still running at the periods the Sumerians calculated, with reed-sighting rods and water clocks and the accumulated patience of generations. The Euphrates is diminished but not gone. The reed beds at the delta are diminished but not gone. The cuneiform is readable to the people who have learned to read it, and they are few but they exist, and some of them will go to work tomorrow and sit with tablets that have not been read in 5,000 years and press their attention into the clay, the way the original stylus pressed, looking for what is there. Whatever is there has been waiting without urgency, without diminishment, without the particular anxiety that living things feel about time. The clay does not know it is being waited for. It simply holds the impression it was given and offers it unchanged to whoever arrives with the patience to look. We will not resolve this tonight. The question is older than this episode and larger than any single account of it can contain, and it will be here in the same form when the next person picks it up. What this night has done is trace the shape of it, not shrink it, not enlarge it, but walk its perimeter carefully enough that the walking itself becomes a kind of knowledge, the kind that does not announce itself as conclusion, the kind that settles slowly into the body, into the rhythm of breathing, into the particular quiet of a mind that has held a large question long enough to feel not its answer, but its weight, and found that weight unexpectedly restful. The room is dark, the tablet is in its drawer, the stars are where the priest left them. Rest now, traveller, the Weld-Blundell prism is still in Oxford. That has not changed. It sits in its sealed case in the Ashmolean Museum, four-sided, 20 centimetres tall, the cuneiform pressed into its surface by hands that understood what they were recording in ways we may not fully share. The phrase is still there at the top of the first column where the scribe began after the kingship descended from heaven. The numbers are still there. 241,000, 200 years, 8 kings, no apology, no annotation. The prism turns slightly in the light the way objects in museum cases do, when the climate control adjusts the air and the cuneiform catches the angle, and for a moment the wedge-shaped marks are very clear. The deliberate pressure of a stylus in wet clay preserved across 50 centuries as cleanly as a sentence written this morning. You began this night with that object. You end it in the same place, but the prism looks different now than it did in the first minutes. Not because it has changed, it has not changed, but because the distance travelled through the night has altered the angle at which it is possible to see it. The traces followed the objections, weighed the patterns, traced across 3 river valleys and 200 flood myths and a chromosome that carries the evidence of its own history folded inside its structure. All of it has accumulated around the prism, like sediment around a stone, not obscuring it but giving it new context, new depth, new capacity to hold the question it has always held without resolving it. History is like this. It does not yield its full meaning to a single approach, a single night, a single discipline. It layers. It holds its ambiguities not as failures of the record, but as properties of the record features, not gaps of a document whose full dimensions have not yet been established. The Sumerians understood something about the world they inhabited, and they wrote it down with the care of people who believed the writing mattered more than whether future readers would understand it correctly. They could not have known what future readers would bring to their tablets, what frameworks, what assumptions, what prior knowledge, what prior ignorance. They wrote anyway. The care was in the act of preservation, not in any guarantee of comprehension. What you carry forward from this night is not a conclusion. It is a residue, the particular texture of questions that have been held carefully enough to become familiar without becoming resolved. The creation account is still procedural. The lunar month calculation is still accurate to 5 decimal places across 5,000 years. The bird sequence still travels across traditions that should not share it. The base 60 system is still on every clock face, still structuring the measurement of time in a form the Sumerians chose for reasons we have not fully recovered. These things are simply true sitting in the record, neither demanding a particular interpretation, nor permitting easy dismissal. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said at the close of this account is that the Sumerians have outlasted every civilization that tried to explain them. The Babylonians absorbed their mythology. The Assyrians preserved their libraries. The Greeks inherited their astronomy through intermediaries they never fully credited. The biblical tradition carried their flood narrative without acknowledging its source, and now we carry the tablets themselves in museum drawers and digital databases, still asking what the people who made them were trying to tell us, still finding in the asking a kind of intimacy with the distant past that no final answer could replace, somewhere in the transmission, somewhere in the long chain of copying and translating and losing and recovering. There may be something that has not yet been recognized for what it is. The scribe who left a blank where the source tablet was too damaged to read was trusting someone to understand that the blank was meaningful. We are still that someone. Let the question rest where it is. You do not need to carry it any further tonight. The prism will be in its case tomorrow. The tablets will be in their drawers. The stars the Sumerian priests recorded will be in the positions they occupy in every hour of every night, indifferent to interpretation, unchanged by attention, running their ancient cycles, regardless of whether anyone below is watching. The night is deep enough now that everything simplifies, the long argument settles, the parallel traditions blur at their edges, the chromosome, the flood, the 6 failed prototypes, the numbers that should not be there. All of it softens into the background from which it came held in the dark available, not urgent. Let your body be heavy. Let the clay hold what it holds. Let the question be as old as it is, which is older than you, which means it was here before you arrived, and will be here after, and your presence with it tonight for these hours was enough. It was the right thing to do with the dark, to move through it carefully, to look at what the light reveals, before the light goes, and then to let the light go. Rest now, traveller. The prism is sealed in its case. The night continues without requiring anything of you.